Pastor John, as you well know, contemporary worship songs get criticized for their repetition. So a lot of them do repeat refrains over and over. So I think the overall critique is fair and should be addressed. But then as we read along together in the Navigator's Bible Reading Plan, we open our Bibles to Psalm 136 today, this morning for me. And it's loaded with repetition. Psalm 136 is unlike any other chapter in the whole Bible, echoing the very same phrase 26 times. For his steadfast love is forever, for his steadfast love is forever, on and on and on. The psalm has never appeared in over 2,000 APJ episodes, so it's overdue, I guess, to talk about. But what is the point of Psalm 136? Why so much repetition, and what does it mean for our debates over repetition in our worship songs today?
I really enjoyed thinking about this psalm. We've read this antiphonally at church many times, with the congregation doing that refrain and the leader doing the narrative. But before I get into the substance, a few style observations and about worship songs. First, this peculiar psalm is really there. Let's just say that. It's there.
Yeah.
It's in the Bible. It's got 26 repetitions of the English phrase, for his steadfast love endures forever, or sometimes translated, for his mercy endures forever, or his loving kindness endures forever. So it sounds like this: give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who alone does great wonders, for his steadfast love endures forever, and onward for 26 repetitions. Second observation, it's rare. There aren't a lot of these.
Yeah, right.
It's not like every psalm reads like this. There's nothing like it again. It's the rarity of it that gives it such force. If all the Psalms did this, we would be worn out.
Yeah.
I mean, something unusual is happening here stylistically. It's so unusual for the Psalms, in fact, that we're driven, which is what you ask, why? Why is he doing this? Third observation, the English refrain, for his steadfast love endures forever, has 10 syllables in it. The Hebrew has only 6, ki la'olam hasdo. That's a cumulative difference or increase of 104 syllables in English in the psalm as a whole. That might make it a slightly different experience. We just need to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
It might have been a little easier to have the refrain, ki la'olam hasdo, ki la'olam hasdo, rather than for his steadfast love endures forever. I mean, it's a significant sound difference. Number 4, repetition by itself is not the problem with contemporary worship songs. That's not the problem. Old great hymns use repetition, like "And Can It Be," right? 5 times. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The issue's not repetition per se, but whether there is enough substance, enough rich content of truth about God woven into the repetitions to justify them, to warrant them. That's the issue. There's a difference between repetitions that are called forth by the repeated crescendo of new glorious truth and repetitions that serve as a kind of mantra without sufficient truth that is simply used to sustain or intensify a mood. Moods in worship should be awakened and sustained primarily by truth assisted by music, not primarily by music with a little truth thrown in to justify the singing. So what strikes us about Psalm 136 is not just that for his steadfast love endures forever occurs 26 times, but that these 26 statements are woven into a truth-laden narrative of the history of Israel. Give thanks. He's God over all gods. He created everything in the universe. He struck down the Egyptians and delivered Israel. He struck down kings of the Amorites and gave Israel the land. He picked them up from distress and delivered their foes. He gives them food. In fact, he gives food to all flesh, verse 25. Give thanks, he's the God of heaven. So there's the main impression you get. The steadfast love of God relates to everything, from the highest heaven of heavens to the nitty-gritty feeding of the birds and the animals, from wilderness wanderings to the destruction of kings. Everything relates to the steadfast love of God. That can't be missed if you're paying attention. But here's what I had not thought of before that I think is so significant. He could have simplified, the psalmist could have simplified the refrain by saying, his steadfast love endures forever. His steadfast love endures forever. That's not what he said. In every single one of the 26 repetitions, he says, because his steadfast love endures forever. Because his steadfast love endures forever. Because his steadfast love endures forever. He made the logic explicit 26 times. That's cumbersome. It really is when you use a for or because. I see that often in contemporary worship songs where the logic seems belabored. And I say, just take that out and make it simpler. It would flow better. The Hebrew word ki, because or for, is thrust forward, number one, in every phrase, every time, 26 times. In other words, all of creation, all of God's superiority over other pretending gods, all of his destruction in Egypt, all of his patience in the wilderness, all of his victory over kings, all of his mercies in distress, all of his food provisions for creatures, all of it is not just vaguely related to the steadfast love of God, it is because of the steadfast love of God. In other words, the psalmist made the refrain more cumbersome with the word because in order not to short-circuit the theological depth that was being driven home, namely, everything God does in creation and history and redemption and consummation is flowing ultimately from his free goodness and mercy and love toward his people. And what makes this especially striking is that this includes his punitive justice against the enemies in Egypt and against the kings of the Amorites. According to this psalm, even when God is bringing destructive justice against his enemies, he has not ceased to act from his steadfast love. So here's the way Edwards put it in his comment on this psalm. He just has one brief comment in his notes on Scripture. The psalm confirms to me that an ultimate end of the creation of the world and of all God's works is his goodness, or the communication of his good to his creatures. For this psalm sufficiently teaches that all God's works, from the beginning of the world to the end of it, are works of mercy to his people. Yea, even the works of his vindictive justice and wrath, as appears in the 10th, 15th, and 17th to the 22nd verses, close quote. So I conclude that the substance here in this psalm is so profound as to warrant 26 repetitions to force us, as it were, to dwell on the logic, on the fact that everything God does is because his steadfast love endures forever.
Yeah, very good. Moods in worship should be awakened and sustained primarily by truth, assisted by music. That's a good word. Thank you, Pastor John. And I'm going to take a stab here in this outro in something that I see in our inbox. We often get worship song questions like this one today from listeners who are trying to find a good church. Maybe that's why you're listening to this episode. You're in a church now, and the worship music is too repetitive. And you may, in fact, be thinking of leaving that church because of the music choices. If that's you, as you make this important decision on what local church is right for you, consider a bunch of other important factors to consider that we have talked about on APJ episodes in the past in our archive. This decision has a lot involved with it. And I tried to take all of those episodes on how to find a local church, how to choose the right local church. I assembled all of that into one digest in the Ask Pastor John book, specifically that section that I titled On Joining, Leaving, and Finding a Church. That's on pages 417 to 428 of that book, if that applies to you. Well, from Christian worship in America, we transition to talking about North Africa and a question from a young Christian woman who lives in a family and a nation dominated by Islam. Will God condemn Muslims for being born into a Muslim country? It's a huge question faced by our brothers and sisters around the world. It's up next time. I'm Tony Reinke. We'll see you on Monday.